There's something I need you to consider tonight. Not a discovery, not a technique you haven't heard of. A failure. The worst spiritual failure in recorded history. Solomon commanded 72 demons by name. He held the ring that made heaven and earth obey. He received wisdom directly from God. Wisdom that made every king on earth send ambassadors just to stand in his presence and listen. And God appeared to him personally, not in a rumor, not in a distant tradition. 1 Kings chapter 3. At Gibeon, while Solomon slept, the Lord appeared and said, "Ask for whatever you want." And then, after the temple was built, after every stone was placed, after the ark was carried in, and the cloud of God filled the holy place. 1 Kings chapter 9. The Lord appeared to Solomon again. Twice. God appeared to this man twice, and in the end, his enemies surrounded him from every direction. His kingdom began to fracture while he still sat on the throne. The enemies came from the north, from the south, from inside his own household, and the God who had appeared to him twice refused to intervene. Tonight, I need to tell you the one thing Solomon stopped doing. Not because I want to frighten you, because I think you are doing exactly what he did. Every single night. I almost didn't make this video. Not because the research wasn't important, it is, but because of what it forced me to remember about myself. In the autumn of 1999, I was in my first year of doctoral study at SOAS, 26 years old, living alone in a small flat in Finsbury Park, North London. I had spent 5 years by that point studying ancient Near Eastern languages, Solomonic manuscripts, the archaeology of the First Temple period. I knew the theology. I'd read the sources in 4 languages, and I stopped praying before I went to bed. Not as a dramatic rejection of faith. Not because I had decided anything. I was tired. The seminars started early. I told myself it didn't matter. One night became 3 nights. 3 nights became a habit. 3 months later, my doctoral supervisor, who had been encouraging and supportive, turned cold and hostile without explanation. A friendship I had relied on for years simply dissolved. I developed a chest infection that wouldn't clear for 2 months. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing you could point to and name. Just a slow, accumulating pressure in every direction. I went back to 1 Kings chapter 11, and I understood what I had been doing. And I understood something else. Solomon had done the same thing. For much, much longer. With consequences that ended a dynasty. Let me walk you through exactly how it happened. This is not a history lesson. This is an autopsy. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. Solomon loved many foreign women, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, nations that God had specifically warned Israel against intermarrying with, not as ethnic prejudice, but because of a documented mechanism. They will turn your hearts to their gods. Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines. That number has distracted commentators for centuries. It is not the number that matters. It is what the text says happened inside those private relationships. 3 stages. First, toleration. Solomon allowed his wives to bring their gods into the household. He permitted it. He said nothing. This was the domestic sphere, away from the temple, away from public sight. The private Solomon and the public Solomon were beginning to diverge. Second, accommodation. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab. He didn't just tolerate the foreign worship, he provided infrastructure for it. He made it easier. Third, participation. The text says his heart was no longer wholly devoted to the Lord his God. He had moved from allowing it, to enabling it, to joining it. Each stage felt like a small concession. Each stage made the next one feel natural, and every single one of these stages happened at night, in the private rooms of his household, in the spaces that God was no longer being invited into. Now I want you to stop here for a moment, because this is where most readings of 1 Kings 11 go wrong. People read this and think, Solomon was seduced by pagan wives. That's the dramatic version, the cautionary tale about temptation. But that reading misses the actual mechanism. The mechanism was not dramatic, it was gradual. It was the slow accumulation of nights in which Solomon went to sleep without speaking God's covenant over his household. One night, the oil was not applied to the doorpost. One night, the declaration was not made. One night, the household was left without its covering. And then the next night, and then the next, until the household had a different spiritual alignment altogether. And Solomon, the man who had asked God to keep his eyes on the temple night and day, had stopped keeping his own eyes on what was happening at night. 1 Kings, chapter 11, verse 9. I need you to sit with this verse. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. That phrase is precise. That phrase is doing something specific. God is not saying, I am disappointed because you forgot me. God is saying, I appeared to you personally, twice, not through a prophet, not through a tradition. I spoke with you face to face. You received covenant from my hands, and you still drifted. The first time I read that phrase as an adult, not as a student cataloging references, but as someone who had just spent 3 months leaving his own door unguarded, I had to put the book down, because that phrase, appeared to him twice, is not a statement of God's grace. It is the indictment. It is the prosecution's exhibit number 1. Because if Solomon, with personal visitations, with supernatural wisdom, with a covenant so explicit that God said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. If Solomon could still drift through daily neglect into complete spiritual abandonment, then the mechanism of loss is not catastrophic failure. It is accumulated small decisions. It is the unguarded night. Repeated. I need to explain something about how the ancient world understood sleep, because this is where the modern reader loses the theological architecture. The Talmud in the tractate Berakot, chapter 5, says, if one recites the Shema before going to bed, the demons are kept away from him. I have watched skeptical colleagues dismiss that sentence in under 3 seconds. I understand the dismissal. I made it for years. But the Talmud then adds something that changes the register entirely. It calls sleep 1/60th of death. 1/60th of death. This is not poetic metaphor. This is architectural description. The rabbis who encoded this theology, and they were heirs to the same tradition Solomon built on, understood that during sleep, the conscious will recedes. The soul, in the language of ancient Near Eastern cosmology, partially withdraws from its waking role as guardian of the body and the home. You are not fully present during sleep. Your waking authority is diminished. This is not superstition. This is a coherent cosmological claim about the architecture of spiritual vulnerability. And if you have not sealed your household before that partial absence, if you have not spoken God's authority over the space where your body lies, then you have entered an unguarded state. Solomon knew this. He built his entire temple theology around it. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 29, he prays, let your eyes be open toward this temple night and day. Night and day, not only during the daylight hours of public worship. Night, the unguarded hours. He understood the architecture. He maintained the seal for years. And then, gradually, through the 3 stages I have described, he stopped. Every night that the covenant was not spoken over his household, the covering became slightly thinner. Every night that the threshold was left unmarked, the perimeter became slightly more permeable, and the wives' gods did not force their way in. They found an opening that had been left unguarded, and they walked through it quietly, one night at a time. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 14 through 25. This is what happened when the protection lifted. The Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite, a man who had been a refugee child who had fled to Egypt after David defeated Edom. He had been waiting, patient, for decades. And now, suddenly, God was no longer restraining him. Then Rezon of Damascus, another enemy who had slipped out of reach during David's campaigns and had been gathering strength in Syria, also waiting. And then, and this is the one that should frighten you most, Jeroboam of Ephraim, from inside Israel, from within Solomon's own household of servants, one of his own administrators. The adversaries came from outside and from inside. For 40 years, under Solomon's full covenant covering, Israel had been unassailable, not because no enemies existed, because the protection was active and maintained. And then, as the covering was withdrawn, not all at once, but layer by layer, night by night, the adversaries that had been held at bay simply stepped forward. They had not become stronger. The restraint had been removed. Think about what that means. The enemies surrounding you are not always new. Sometimes they have been waiting outside a door that you stopped sealing before bed. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. I read this verse at 17 as advice about aging gracefully, at 22 as a meditation on mortality, at 30 as literary melancholy. It wasn't until I was sitting in a monastery in Lalibela, Ethiopia, holding a manuscript that had not seen sunlight for 400 years, that I understood what this verse actually is. It is a confession. Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes at the end of his life. The rabbinical tradition is consistent on this. Ecclesiastes is the last text attributed to him. It is written from the wreckage. Remember your Creator before the evil days come. He is not giving philosophical advice. He is describing the exact moment of his own failure. He stopped, remembering, not all at once, not dramatically, day by day, night by night, until the evil days had arrived and he was already inside them, already looking back at the years of glory from the other side. He sat down and wrote it all out, so that someone reading it 3,000 years later would understand what the drift feels like from the inside, and stop before it is too late. When a teacher speaks, they transmit wisdom they live by. When someone warns, they speak from the memory of what it cost them. Solomon is not teaching in Ecclesiastes. He is warning. He is reaching across 30 centuries with the specific knowledge of a man who had everything: wisdom, wealth, protection, 2 direct encounters with God, and lost it through gradual nightly neglect. He wrote it so you would not have to learn this the way he did. I want to tell you about my grandmother. In Nsukka, when I was very young, before I understood any of this, my grandmother had a practice she kept every night without exception. Before she went to bed, she went to every door of the house, every entrance, every threshold, and she spoke. I didn't fully understand the words. She used formal Igbo, and I was young enough that the register was above me. But the rhythm was unmistakable. The deliberateness was unmistakable. She was saying something specific at each door, something that belonged to that moment and no other. As a teenager, I filed it under ritual habit. As a student, I filed it under indigenous practice worth noting. At 26, after 3 months of unguarded nights in London, I understood it was neither of those things. In Yoruba and Igbo spiritual cosmology, traditions that have preserved knowledge the colonial encounter tried to erase, the night is understood as the hour when the spirit world is most active. The Oj, what some translate as witches, though the word carries more than that, they move after midnight. Familiar spirits, ancestral forces, entities with permission to operate in darkness, and the prayers spoken at each threshold before sleep are not superstition passed down through fear. They are the recognition of an architecture. The same architecture 1 Kings chapter 11 confirms. Your household has a spiritual perimeter. That perimeter must be consciously maintained. Every night, without exception. Not because God is weak and needs your help, because you are the steward of what is under your roof, and stewardship requires daily exercise. My grandmother didn't have the Talmud. She didn't have the manuscript from Lalibela. She had 3,000 years of transmitted wisdom, carried through oral tradition, because generations before her had seen what happened when it was abandoned. She was doing what Solomon's priests did in the temple, what Solomon himself did for the years of his glory. When I called my mother from London in 1999, she listened to me describe the accumulation of the previous 3 months, the supervisor, the friendship, the chest infection, the sense that every direction had become slightly harder. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Chukwu still watches the door, but only you can invite him in." I put down the phone. I went to the doorframe of my flat. I spoke. Not with academic precision, not elegantly. Just, "God, this is my door. You are welcome here. Nothing else is." The pressure did not lift immediately. Spiritual protection is not a transaction, and I don't want to suggest it is. But something in the architecture of that flat shifted. I have no other language for it. The unguarded state ended the moment I stopped leaving the door open. Now I want to give you something practical. Because understanding why Solomon fell is the diagnosis. But if I stop there, you will leave with the knowledge of what killed the patient and no understanding of how to stay alive. Solomon, in the years of his glory, before the drift began, before the 3 stages took hold, maintained what I can only call the bedtime covenant seal. 4 components, each one grounded in the texts he left us, each one taking less than 3 minutes in total. The first, speak God's name over your household, out loud. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 29, Solomon himself asks God to keep his eyes on the temple night and day. He is asking for a sustained presence. But presence in the covenant architecture of the ancient world requires invitation. It requires the active voice of the covenant holder. Tonight, before you lie down, stand at the entrance to your bedroom. Say aloud, "The Lord watches over this house tonight. No spirit may enter that God has not sent." I know what some of you are thinking. Why out loud? Why not in my head? Because in ancient Near Eastern theology, the theology Solomon built his entire kingdom on, the spoken word activates covenant. God spoke creation into existence. The priests in the temple did not think their prayers. They spoke them. Your voice is not ceremonial. It is functional. It marks the spiritual reality of what you are declaring. The second, seal the entrance. You know the Passover theology. Exodus chapter 12, verse 23. The Lord will pass over the doorway marked with blood. The threshold, the doorpost, is a spiritual category. It has been since the night in Egypt. Solomon's priests anointed the doorposts of the temple. This was not decoration, it was the marking of territory. Anoint the doorpost of your bedroom with olive oil tonight. Left side, right side, top. The oil does not protect by chemistry. It is the physical act of claiming this space under God's authority. Territory claimed cannot be easily contested. Territory left unmarked makes no such statement. The third, speak the names of your bloodline. When Solomon dedicated the temple, he asked God to hear the prayers of the people when they prayed toward it. He named them by category, by relationship, by covenant. Before you sleep tonight, speak the names of those under your roof, your children, your spouse, your parents in your care. Say their names aloud to God. I cover this name with the blood of the covenant tonight. No assignment against them has authority in this house. This is not a formula. It is a declaration of spiritual stewardship. You are speaking their covering into existence with the authority you carry over your household. Solomon had this authority. For 40 years he exercised it, and then, quietly, gradually, one night at a time, he stopped. The force. Recite Psalm 4, verse 8. In peace I will lie down and sleep. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. This was David's night psalm. Solomon knew it from childhood. He would have spoken it, or its equivalent in the temple liturgy, throughout the years when Israel was untouchable. Say it tonight. Out loud. Not as sentiment, not as habit, as a declaration of territorial reality. You are stating, before you close your eyes, whose jurisdiction this sleep is under. Not abandoned, not unguarded, covered. 4 steps, less than 3 minutes. Solomon built one of the ancient world's great architectural and spiritual monuments. He managed trade routes and diplomatic relationships with Egypt, Phoenicia, Arabia, and the lands of the East. He still sealed his household before sleeping. Until he didn't. Until the nights accumulated. Until the covering had been lifted so gradually he didn't notice it was gone. I want to close with something I cannot shake. When I read 1 Kings 11 now, not as a doctoral student looking for political theology, but as a man who made Solomon's mistake in miniature in 1999 and learned what even a 3-month version of it costs, I am arrested by what the text does not say. It doesn't say Solomon woke up one morning and decided to abandon God. There was no dramatic apostasy, no moment of deliberate rejection. It says, when he was old, his heart had turned, past tense, already completed. The turning had happened before he noticed it. He didn't see it until the adversaries were already rising. That is the most terrifying kind of drift, because you cannot feel the covering lifting. You feel it in the consequences. You feel it when the supervisor turns cold, when the friendship collapses, when the enemies that should not have found a way in are already inside. And Solomon, with direct divine visitations, with supernatural wisdom, with a covenant so explicit and personal that God said, I have heard your prayer and chosen this place, still couldn't see it happening to him until it was done. That should stop all of us. Because if it could happen to him, it can happen to anyone. It can happen in London in 1999. It can happen in Lagos tonight. It can happen in Atlanta, in Accra, in Birmingham, in Houston. One unguarded night at a time. One unmarked threshold at a time. One unspoken name at a time. Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes from the wreckage. He sat with everything he had lost, and he wrote down the warning he wished someone had spoken to him before the drift had gone too far. Remember your Creator before the evil days come. Not when they arrive. Before. because by the time they arrive, the pattern is already months old. The gate has already been left open one night too many. He left us this. He left us the forensic account of exactly how his protection failed. He left us the specific mechanism. He left us the warning in Ecclesiastes. And through the texts his priests preserved, he left us the 4 steps that maintained the covering during all the years when Israel was unassailable. Tonight, when you go to bed, stand at your door, speak God's name over your household, seal the threshold, name the people under your roof before God, and say David's night psalm aloud before your eyes close. Choose which Solomon you want to resemble. The one God appeared to twice, who governed with supernatural authority, or the one who stood at the end of his life and wrote, "Remember your Creator before the evil days come, because I did not. And I know what comes after." He left you the choice. He left you the warning. What you do with it is yours.